I think when you consider the history of music, especially in America, I think it was one of the most important periods ever. And Motown went on to influence everyone. It was one of the most important things in the history of mankind. The fact that a black man in very troubled racial times in Detroit became the leader in pop music. They had 90 or more #1 pop hits with black artists in a time that black artists had no freedoms in America.
How do you borrow $800 from your family kitty, and on the structure of that $800 you build this incredible edifice, which was the greatest achievement in independent record companies there's ever been. Rhythm and blues was crossing over under the name of rock and roll. And then in 1954, the first rock and roll hits appeared in the hit parade.
There were a lot of black artists, R&B artists that we now, know as being world famous and being architects of rock and roll, who couldn't get played on pop radio. So people like Little Richard, Fats Domino, they were writing these great songs. But it was Pat Boone who had a hit with Ain't That a Shame. Pat also did Tutti Frutti. And so there were white versions of a lot of black songs.
And then in 1956, I saw Elvis Presley give America black people.
Because it wasn't what people wanted. He was going against the grain. He took old black blues songs and converted them into something that he could really make for himself.
But of course, the tremendous enthusiasm for him meant that young people accepted it.
Barry Gordy at this particular time was doing a guy named Barrett Strong. And Barrett Strong was singing a song called Money, and it became a big, big hit.
Barry had been a successful songwriter for Jackie Wilson. And Bill Robinson, Smokey, said, "Barry, you should start your own label."
He worked for Ford Motor Company, and he worked on the assembly line. And he began to marvel at how he would go to work or come to work in the morning, and at the end of the day, you have this brand new, beautiful vehicle. He actually used that same simple technology in applying it to his artists.
When Motown was being established, was bringing on young writers such as Lamont Dozier.
I went in as a songwriter, producer, artist, and whatever else they could throw on the plate. And shortly thereafter, he brought in Smokey Robinson and Miracles. And so that went very well, as you know, with Shop Around, and then he signed another little group called Marvelettes with Please Mr. Postman happened.
This place was open 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and there was just a hit factory, one after the other after the other.
These things happened in this era of civil rights, and in the face of persistent, now inconceivable hatred. This did affect Motown slightly, in the sense that some of their early albums did not show black people. For example, Please Mr. Postman, the album by the Marvelettes, did not show any human beings. It showed a mailbox. And as late as 1965, the Isley Brothers, This Old Heart of Mine, had 2 white teenagers at the beach on the cover. The young Americans who had grown up without the 100 years plus of prejudice had just taken this to their hearts. It didn't occur to them to think it was anything other than what it was. And the Motown records regularly went into the charts in an astonishing way.
He did start with the idea of creating a sound that would transcend race and transcend the boundaries that we found ourselves in this nation in the 50s. And he was very successful in doing that. It was the sound of young America.
Not the sound of black America, not the sound of Negro America. It was the sound of young America.
The question came up, well, I don't want my music just heard by this group of people, by the only African Americans at the time. I want my music to be enjoyed by everybody. Why don't we just make it music for everybody? And so that was a shift in thinking, to be able to sort of think outside of the prescribed record industry boxes.
The lyrics themselves, weren't about civil rights, but what was about civil rights was the fact that all these acts, black acts, were crossing over to the pop charts. There was something different about Motown. I mean, the Supremes in their dresses and their wigs, they were incredibly glamorous. They became like American royalty. Berry Gordy had all these acts record, not just the hits, but he had them record other albums. So the Supremes sing Rodgers and Hart. The Four Tops did a Broadway album. So he was really integrating that music with white pop music. You didn't think about it. You just accepted these acts. There was the Beach Boys, there were the Supremes, there were the Beatles and the Four Tops. It was like you were colorblind when you thought about these acts. And that was very subtle. Whether it was intended or not, Mary Wilson actually had a middle-aged white woman who come up to her at this time, and she said to her, we don't let our children watch Negroes on television, but they love the Supremes, and that's just okay with us. So it definitely advanced the civil rights movement.
It was at a time, there were dark times in the racial struggle in America, and they had 90 #1 pop hits by black artists, which was completely unheard of. You probably will never hear of that again.
I think that it was basically the social backdrop and the music and the record industry feeding off of each other and informing each other. And maybe these songs inadvertently initially started to strike a nerve within the social fabric. Obviously the artists, such as Marvin Gaye and the writers, etc., started to take notice of this and be able to now reincorporate this and use it as food for their creativity.
They'd already sold millions of records, and they were like, okay, I got a platform. Now let me use this to really help to enlighten the public about my view of what I think is going on. Exactly the song, what's going on.
So almost every artist would have songs that reflected the world condition. But although he wasn't steering it, Berry Gordy approved of it, but because he agreed with it and it was profitable. What's to resist?
You're talking about not only the civil rights era, you're talking about the emergence of Martin Luther King and Malcolm X and other leaders as strong political figures. You're also talking about the Vietnam War.
It's a tall order to compare how Motown contributed to the civil rights movement in comparison to seminal figures such as Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X. Did it contribute, I think, to the overall atmosphere? It did. And by this music being able to reach across racial lines, to me, Motown and its aesthetic, its level of songwriting, musicianship, professionalism in the performers, really held a mirror up to the social consciousness.
So here we have a picture of our founder, Mr. Berry Gordy, and also Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., civil rights activist, along with Miss Lena Horne and also Dr. Billy Taylor, a jazz professor from Southern University. Dr. King's I Have a Dream speech was debuted here for the first time ever in the city of Detroit on June 23rd of 1963 after the Freedom March. Before Dr. King left town, our mobile recording unit recorded his speech live, brought it back home, gave it that Motown magic, and gave Dr. King the very first copy and also the rights to the speech. Along with Dr. King being a humanitarian, he's also a Motown recording artist.
The night after Martin Luther King was assassinated, the Supremes were invited on the Johnny Carson show to talk, and they sang Somewhere from West Side Story. And they had always had a little portion of that song where they spoke. Well, from that night on, they changed that spoken word part to talk about Dr. Martin Luther King's dream. They weren't doing what Martin Luther King was doing, but in their own way, they were advancing civil rights to me. I mean, I actually saw that in them on The Tonight Show that night with Johnny Carson was very emotional.
And in that horrible year of 1968, which was the most difficult year for America and for Western civilization in my lifetime, a year which featured the assassinations of Martin Luther King and Robert Kennedy, the Vietnam War at full tilt. And I asked Marvin in the mid-70s if that had been what had set him towards thinking about the issues which he addressed in the What's Going On album in 1971. And he said he hadn't thought about it, but it made sense to him.
We're not all artists. And what makes people such as Marvin Gaye and the way he delivered some of those protest songs so effective is that he was able to communicate how we were feeling and articulate in a way that non-artists we couldn't get that out. And it gave us that voice.
So Marvin had this great, legendary success, and What's Going On is still considered one of the top 10 albums of all time.
I'm pretty sure that in the early 60s, when people were making pop music singles, they probably weren't thinking of any kind of lasting legacy or that these songs would have any impact beyond the few weeks they were on the chart. But here we are 50 years later, and, you know, these songs are our treasures. I mean, they're our culture.
The information technology age has had a fascinating effect on how young people experience the past. Anything that happened before breakfast is equally old. People love Motown, but they don't think, oh, the social circumstances that bred these records were. They just think, after the fact, Stevie Wonder, genius, all-time great recording artist, or Marvin Gaye, visionary, or Supreme, the top girl group of all time. The story of the great people of history and of entertainment is fascinating. They didn't do everything in one afternoon. They had a series of experiences. And it's that series of experiences which makes their accomplishments even more remarkable. To think that Berry Gordy could have been on an assembly line and applied that to music and wound up with what he did, it is amazing. And it becomes more amazing with each passing day because no one else is doing it.
You know, the Tops, I remember Duke Faker coming back from Europe. He said, man, do you realize how big you guys are? Because we didn't actually hear about it. Nobody was telling us just how prominent we were in the music, in the business. Every day somebody will go, oh, Mr. Dozier, thanks for the music. They still recognize the feeling, the sound. And then we put something out there that I think will last forever.
These things just don't happen now. People don't make records about social change, about war protest. For people who've been around the block a few times like me, it's very frustrating because you want to think that music can still be a progressive force in society, whereas now it's mostly a recreational force in society.
Everything that's going on now may not even have a shelf life of 2 to 3 years, let alone 5 or 10, certainly not 30 or 40 or 50. This is why the music industry is in turbo spin.
I mean, this is not to say that the people who are making these records are evil, but it's just they're kind of disappointing me because they have more power than they know. And if they used it, they could affect social change. Motown was perfectly placed to both reflect and inspire social change.